renewable energy projects in Africa has not reached its full potential. For example, green bonds that were issued between 2014 and 2020 globally was about $1 trillion, of which only 0.2% were represented for Africa. I mean, if you have such minute green bonds being issued, clearly we would have problems even being able to finance our renewable energy. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, green bonds form a key link between the capital providers and renewable energy projects. As of 2020, when you then break down even the green bonds that were issued to look at how much of that was used to finance renewable energy, about 23% of green bonds issued globally were utilized in financing, whereas, can you move to the next slide, please? Whereas locally, the percentage of the green bonds that were issued and used to finance renewable energy, it's even much, much smaller. So what are some of the outcomes of COP27 that can help us to address this landscape? If you move to the next slide, please. COP27 focused on building on two key commitments made by Africa at the last COP26, namely renewed commitments to nationally determined contributions and commitment to contextual energy transition. And of course, in being able to do that, we were looking at how would we be able to have clear plans for energy generation diversification, despite the need for oil, given the Russian-Ukraine war, and also how do we ensure there's fulfillment of the $100 billion yearly promise for climate finance. On the other hand, for the multilateral agreements, we're also looking to see whether there will be development of initiatives to partner on renewable energy to reduce the emissions that we are facing. However, COP27 was a bit light on the implementation of these previous promises at the end of the day, although we still had some interesting investment commitments to contextual energy transition in Africa, and I will name just a few of some of the things that came out. So we had $2 billion to build new solar projects in Angola that was given as a commitment. Angola is one of the African countries that have taken renewable energy projects very seriously, so one is not surprised by this partnership. Also, $500 million has been given to finance and facilitate Egypt's transition to clean energy. This will be financed in partnership with the European Union and Germany. And it's not surprising as well. It was clear, going to Egypt and listening to their story, that Egypt actually started its energy transition some years back, and they've been able to increase their electricity generation by 20% using renewable energy sources, such as tidal waves, looking at the sea, solar energy, hydrogen gas, and waste to fuel. And this was financed by their partner, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, who invested $1.1 billion in 2012. So this additional funding is not surprising at all. We also have the Climate Solidarity Pact between developed and emerging economies, proposed by the UN Secretary General and international financial institutions, that they would provide financial and technical assistance to help emerging economies accelerate their renewable energy transition. This definitely will help us to tackle one of the challenges that we face in financing renewable energy projects in Africa. And the challenges are outlined. For one, the banks struggle to finance these projects because the green assets are not really bankable. The commercial viability are often, no, can you go back to the next slide? The commercial viability are often not yet defined, and it does not meet the risk appetite of the banks. I'm still on the challenge page. If you go back to the next slide, please. The previous slide before this one. There are no regulatory push as well to drive the adoption of green energy. There's lack of clear, sustainable finance framework, and there's inadequate understanding of the awareness of the opportunities for green bonds. Lastly, the technical know-how is just not there. So what are we proposing? We need to have regulatory measures to enable green energy in Africa. Those regulatory measures need to focus on the market regulators. By the time we look at the policymakers and government, for example, removing the subsidies that we currently have on fossil fuel subsidies, integrating clean energy policies as part of the broader national infrastructure, energy, environment, and climate strategy framework, those would help propel focus in this particular area. When we are also having more access to sustainable finance, sustainable grants, loans, that will definitely drive this market. If we also look at from the buyers and consumers perspective, we need to have policymakers and government encouraging utilization of renewable energy. So for example, if you have feed-in tariff as incentives, this will drive adoption of renewable energy. From a retailer's perspective as well, ability to issue tradable green certificates, mandating specific loan portfolios for renewable energy infrastructure within the development financial institutions or our banks will drive this area. And of course, developing energy financing policies would also be very helpful. Lastly, for the investors, we need to have policymakers and government that should encourage private sector investments in this particular area. In conclusion, there are key imperatives we need to look at that would help us drive financing for new African oil and gas projects. One is a clear decision to manage emissions, so go the clean energy route. The other is that our earnings must be invested in cleaner sources of energy going forward. And lastly, we need to focus on gas over oil. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tommy, for setting the stage for our next discussion. Now, I'd like to bring up members of my panel. We'll try and keep this short and quick and be done within the next at least 40 minutes or so. Let me bring up Nicole Roberti. She's the Minister of Economy and Recovery for the Republic of Gabon. Please join us on the stage. A round of applause, please. Also joining us on this particular panel, Mohamed El Katani, CEO of Attijari Wafa Bank. We'll also be joined by Michael Young-Neil, CEO of FMO. With us already on the stage, we have Valérie Kojo Diop, the Director for Innovation and Sustainable Development. Thank you very much for your time. If I may, Ferdinand Kemoun, Managing Director of the Aura Group, please come up to the stage. And finally, we were supposed to have on this panel a little much later on the Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, Godwin Emefiele, but he is not present with us today. However, the Director of Monetary Policy for the Central Bank of Nigeria, Dr. Hassan Mahmoud, is here with us in his place. Please come up to the stage. If I may, just to involve the audience from a very early stage, from your perspective, COP27, was it an on goal? Did it live up to expectations? Just by show of hands. Did it live up to expectations, or was it a major disappointment? Anyone? COP27? No one wants to respond. COP27, was it a major disappointment? Yes or no? By show of hands. Major disappointment. Okay, all right. Major disappointment. Blaghi, let's start with you. Why? Why was it a major disappointment?
Well, I will temper a little bit, my comment there. I think that in terms of adaptation, in terms of loss and damages, commitments, someone could say that it was so-so, right? But in terms of attenuation, in terms of commitments, to still be below 1.5 degree, I think it's a real disappointment. But still, does it mean that, because the question, the way you've been asking it, does it mean that it altered the energy financing, for Africa? I would say, does it alter green financing energy in Africa? Because basically, I think that liquidity in terms of green energy is there. I think that we're lacking more and more, financing, for brown energy. So this has to be, taken into account. So, but the liquidity is there. And the question would be rather, at what cost? and how and what would be the form, to trap and to capture, to encapsulate, liquidity which is there. So I think that's the main question that we have, to think about. So when I look at the market, especially on the investment market, there's a more and more, appetite for green investment. And I would say that, impact funds are the ones, that raising the most interest, for this kind of assets. So it's a matter, to be able, to originate, the proper asset in order to attract, this kind of liquidity. I was talking about, affordability, because sometimes, I'm asking the question about, does green is profitable, for bank? And we need to find some pocket of liquidity, that will add a little bit more, in order to get it, profitable and to attract, money coming from even, development bank or even, private money or commercial banks, attracting. We need to put some sort of additionality. And when I'm thinking of that, I'm thinking about the carbon market. Carbon market, could be an avenue. I think that we need, to populate and to make the more and more, aware of, the governments, in Africa of, the carbon market. I think even, that Africa is a market maker, for carbon.
Actually, that's a good point you raise. Let me come to you, Madam Minister. When it comes to building that carbon market, the value he's talking about, what do we need to do to get that done? Because Gabon has been a bit of a leader in that space.
Merci, Monsieur le Modérateur.
Thank you, Moderator. Let me assume this duty before answering your question. We've come to Togo. We were invited by the highest-ranking authorities. So I would like to thank them, thank the organizers. That issue of carbon market. And how about the lessons learned from COP27 before coming back to your question per se? We still have a long way to go. Now, we had our awareness raised for African countries, and international financial institutions should mobilize themselves and find ways and means that are innovative to support that energy transition. Now, coming back to the carbon market, for some time now, as you're well aware, Gabon undertook, thanks to the leadership of the President of the Republic, to fight against or deal with adaptation and climate change. We've come a long way. We've had certification of carbon credit of Gabon by United Nations bodies. We've had discussions, lengthy discussions with partners, investment funds, the banks, the operators, and as we speak today, we believe that we are ready to trade that carbon. Nonetheless, in spite of the fact that we've put in place the legal framework, which is critical to be able to support these operations, we've done advertisement with all MPs, the people, to show the relevance of climate change issues. And we designated the Strategic Investment Fund in Gabon to be a strategic partner to trade our carbon. We've had some disappointments, but we will deal with it, because in front of us we need demand. We cannot trap that demand unless by people who can buy carbon. On this matter, we're still expecting a lot. Discussions we've had in Egypt will allow us to pursue this endeavor, and we believe that in the next month we'll have the very first operation of selling carbon. Obviously, there is issues of organizing the market, because we need to be dealing in a regulated market. We still have a long way to go, and so we're about to come to the end of that endeavor to be able to sell carbon. Thank you.
We have African countries at the forefront around how carbon markets will work. But getting back to the question around liquidity, where is the money? Let's come to the bankers on the panel. This is a question for you, Mohamed and Ferdinand. when it comes to green financing, we saw it from Tommy's presentation, right? There's capital. We say there's capital everywhere around the continent, outside the continent, but it's not necessarily going into green projects. Why, Ferdinand?
Oui, merci, Rama. Alors, effectivement,
Yes, you're right. Capital. Our understanding is that we have liquidity. Capital is out there, but there is a problem. How can we reallocate this capital? First of all, mobilizing the capital and allocating the capital to the green energy market. I'm talking on the standpoint of an organization that's signed the principle of responsible banking. That means that we want to be good in redeploying the capital that we're going to collect or mobilize on the international market. Two sources of liquidity. Let me say three. The first one, we have the green bonds markets. On this one, our organization is preparing to go and get liquidity on the green bond market, the DFIs. My neighbor here is going to talk more about that. And the third one, I'm glad that the minister talked about the credit carbon markets, because it is there. As an African, we can find a form of justice if we're projecting that the tons of carbon is $100 and in the future year. So we can see that clearly there is a real capacity of cash generating opportunities to finance our renewable energy. I'd like to urge our government and organizations to get into this market and not allow the others to dictate the rules on the market. Thank you. Well, thank you. I'd like to thank the government of Togo and the organizers for inviting our institution to be part of this conference. Let me refer you back to an approach, which is a pragmatic approach. And this is the experience of the country I'm representing here, which is Morocco. We had a vision, a long-term vision, promoted by the head of state, His Majesty the King, and he gave the guidelines for the energy mix of 42% by 2020. We reached out. This was achieved, and he decided a new target, 2030, 52% by 2030. But this vision was built on a framework, institutional framework, a regulatory framework as well, that helps to give us visibility to investors, international and local investors, and also allow all the stakeholders, commercial banks, development banks, and insurance companies to mobilize the necessary resources to support these projects. That's why, thanks on the PPP law, thanks to the institutional framework that gives us a legal security and backup to international financier, we mobilize in local, foreign currency funds that are really interesting to support this project of implementing our capacity regarding renewable energy. I can say that this experience was a success story, because the wind park of Morocco and the solar park of Morocco, the wind is the first capacity on the African continent. Wind in Morocco. Solar is the first solar plant of energy generating plant that is operated thanks to resources mobilizing in local currency. Why? First, because the regulator got adjusted to the financing to those kinds of projects by really giving us possibility in terms of risk coefficient. They gave more ability for us to go to the market. Second important element, project finance without using shareholders, project developers, international investors and local investors are invited on board. And in the reserve of insurance companies, we have an incentive system that help the insurance companies and also pension funds to take tickets, equity investment on these projects. That's why we could mobilize there as a commercial bank by complementing our enrichment financing on tenures that are long, more than 15-year tenures for those financing, which is important. We also, thanks to a partnership with the Green Climate Fund of the United Nations, Today, we are the first bank on the African continent of the region to be certified to mobilize such funds that help us to syndicate concession loans to the tenors that may be 40 years and to spread courses that are so low concession rates with the DFIs and alongside with international investors to mobilize resources. So to me, the problem is through that there is an issue of how we can mobilize the financing or the resources, but above the financing, which is the tip of the iceberg, we need to set the framework to ensure the flow of liquidity in terms of volume, the flow of liquidity in terms of maturity, and also in terms of cost. And the institution framework is important to back up the vision. It's a legal security for the investment and the quality of the sponsors in the context of these projects. Yes, what I'd like to say, it is very wonderful, all these projects. We have a market, local financing markets that are providing opportunity for green bonds. Benin raised a green bond on a sub-regional market. So the BRVM, we need to set a framework that can be well structured to allow other issuers to come and be able to get transactions. Let me say that, talking about the green energy, we also talk about projects that are small projects, for instance, off-grid, mini-grid project as well, that are small-scale projects, that are not projects that will attract globally all the classical bankers due to the amount involved and also due to the profitability. So we need also to consider this segment, which is very important, and these, the ticket size, and also these African ingenuity, not only the blockbusters that are in energy. We need to have smaller shareholders, access to financing, to have incubators, and also to have business angels. We need to promote those business angels or major corporates on the African continent have money that can support and back up those kind of initiatives. This is very important in my opinion. When you consider the energy sector, we can say it is a breakdown. We have the major ones, we have the green bonds, we have sustainable bonds, we have commercial banks, smaller ones, and some are not even profitable. And this is like a philanthropic foundation and blended finance as well that can tackle this kind of project. So while it's important, I just want to add something in terms of carbon, the carbon market. Africa is a market maker of carbon. So we need, as African state, to understand the markets, the carbon market. Training is important. As a BOAD, as an institutions, this is on the top of our priority. We have also another asset, which is an interesting asset, which needs to be discussed as well, is the impact and how we can monetize the impact. The impact bashing is there. We've had people like Goldman Sachs that had ESG bashing, and they have $4 million a few days ago. I think that this is going to help each of us to avoid this washing agenda. But the topic of the impact is important. There is liquidity on the impact market. So of course people say that we need to prove the impact. We need to have the good intention. What is the added value? Particularly, how can we assess the impact to avoid the greenwashing? So I think that this is a blending of so many things that can help us to address the issue. By Africa, we should stand up and be determined, committed. It's not because we did not succeed in getting the liquidity during the COP that we need to be discouraged. This should be, it should prompt us into actions on the African continent rather.
Panel, there's a House announcement I do need to make. The President is asking to see the Director General of the PIA. I'm not sure if he's here. The President needs to see the Director General of the PIA. So just a House announcement, but we'll get back to the conversation. I will come back to you in just a moment, Madam Minister. But Michael, DFIs are getting mentioned a fair bit in this conversation. And it comes in two parts. One, as a source of capital, but also as a way of de-risking investments into green bonds. Is that happening? And if not, why?
Yeah, it's absolutely happening. So I represent FMO, the Dutch DFI. Quick, we have 13 billion assets under management in our total portfolio, of which 4 billion is in Africa. It's mainly in financial institutions, renewable energy, and agri. So we focus on those three. And we cover a large spectrum of what has passed now. So for instance, we did with our partners at EcoBank a sustainable bond last year. But we also do small off-grid solar in Burkina Faso very recently. And the interesting thing here is there is a lot of capital available, but of course, especially with a recession coming up, risk is the big thing. And the question is, how can we de-risk it? Because we all know that in the end, we will need the large commercial investors in there to really scale up. Because that's the whole point. The scale is small. And if we need to scale up, we need to de-risk. And how do we do that? And I think it was mentioned, blended finance is a very important instrument. And I think the excellent presentation we got from Tommy also highlighted that there is a lot of fossil fuel subsidies. And I don't think per se these subsidies need to go to green and renewables. But if we think about more innovative structures around blended finance, where we can de-risk a number of the issues that are out there, we can much more scale that. And that's exactly what we're trying to do as DFI, and we're very much looking for partners, both from Europe, but also, of course, in the implementation part in Africa to further spur that. And I think it's a matter of daring. So as a DFI, as FMO, we are trying to take more risk than others, because that's, I think, what we're supposed to do. So we'll also continue, and I think that's the question was, what lessons should Africa's financial institutions take away? I think what is very important is to keep the eye on the ball, on the long-term ball, and not be too much detracted now. Of course, we need to react in the coming year and 1 or 2 years, but the long-term game will be renewable energy, and that type of long-term finance we can bring. But if we do blend it with help from governments, from help of big philanthropies, we will be able to crowd in the commercial investors, and then we can really scale. But we also need on the ground enough projects that are actually bankable. Because that's the other spectrum. There is for now enough, but for financing all the SDGs by 2030, there's just not enough. And that's also what we're doing with market creation. For the purpose of this conversation, what are we defining as a bankable project? Because part of the problem with this conversation tends to be, we say, okay, there's capital, but it's not finding bankable projects. But we know there's demand for energy, right? Up and down the continent. You've got 600 million people who are yet to get onto the grid. So what's bankable in our context? Yeah, I think there are two things. There are many things, but let me highlight two things. So bankable is basically when it's self-sustainable from a financial perspective. And that's not per se the case, that's one. And the other one, it needs to have a stable regulatory regime in order to provide only not clarity for the next 2, 3, 4 years, but also long-term clarity. And if you're able to make it financial, feasible, sustainable for the long term, in a stable regime, then we're talking about something that's bankable. It's not NGO financed then anymore. Because you don't want a situation where you're investing in a power plant and then 2 years down the line, the tariff regime has changed. The pricing has changed. And if the PPA goes down the drain, investors will look at that country and say, we're not going to invest in there anymore. And then stuff that might look bankable will become unbankable. And that's really the wrong way to go. Dr. Hassan, if I may come to you, because you sit in a unique position as Director of Monetary Policy at the Central Bank of Nigeria. And the CBN has done some interesting things in contrast to other central banks. You actually go into the market and say, we're going to back specific lending for specific problems. You've done that with rice. You've done that with agriculture. What's the bank's thinking around climate change or climate-related projects? Is that something that you might do a specific funding vehicle for?
Yeah, I think we are going that direction, but let me just also clear something. In terms of the interventions that the central bank has done, we've got very severe backlash from the people and from the government in terms of how central banks is going to quasi-fiscal activities. We're dealing with that. Because the argument is what? That, you're a central bank, you should be dealing with regulation. Leave it to the fiscal. Not leave it to, go and face inflation. So that is coming at a cost. But the point I want to raise, and the emphasis here in Nigeria, is the fact that even within the climate change activities, there's the issues of loss and damages and the issue of common differential responsibilities. we are mindful of the fact that Nigeria or African countries must come to an effective competitive level to go into a sustainable transition. Example, Nigeria now, we're actually trying to get investments into fossil fuels because of what we see, the investment that is going into there. One is a priority to central bank in the sense that our major source of foreign exchange inflows is from oil exports. In the last 1 year, we have not gotten $1 from the oil exports, and that is having severe impact in the management of FX. So if you are telling Nigeria to go and do carbon, green bonds and all that, and your basic responsibilities are failing, your people are getting poorer and poorer. We are contributing, we know the effects of this climate change. Nigeria has what we call a Climate Change Act that is signed into law in 2021 by the president, and that is being implemented. But the emphasis I'm making here is that there's a need to have a sustainable transition. You don't just do a bandwagon effect. Everybody's going in there, you want to go in there, and then you're getting poorer and poorer. And then your people are rejecting you the more and more. As I speak to you now, there are a lot of placards in Nigeria that the central bank governor should be removed. So, but that is not the essence of it. We need to go with the pace of our economic development, of the potentials we have in our economy. These damages or climate change is impacting on us severely, but we should also look at those that caused the climate change and how much are they responsible, in taking back some of these damages to our economy. So that shared, responsibility, it is very, very critical. And when you ask people, raise your hand, whether COP27 was a success, you saw the hands that came up. In any case, I don't think anybody expected something different, because that has been the sequence. But the important thing is that African countries, African economies need to also come to a competitive standpoint where when they speak, they can be listened to. And when their priorities are not met, they can fight for those parameters to be met as a common goal for the entire globe. I think that's what I'll bring up for now.
Valerie, do you want to jump in? And then the Minister. Valerie first.
I just wanted to ask a question to Dr. Hassan. In terms of, how do you view your role in terms of central bank? Because, we're thinking about, well, the money is the key, just to drive, and just to incentivize, the people, to originate, green asset. So you because I know that the role of the central bank normally is to regulate, inflation and all that, but there's a lot of people which are talking about inflation, which is, contraction of the climate and the impact of climate on price. And I was just thinking, whether central bank will have some sort of greenness of the, monetary policy, the same that we've seen, with the ECB, in Europe, or even, you can see that, even with the South African Reserve Bank, starting, to want, to do some sort of green quantitative easing, just to incentivize the people to originate, green assets.
Yeah.
So that's
the central bank has actually championed what we call the banking sustainability principles, which has been in effect since 2016-17, and that has been applied to how banks are able to finance, green projects and all that. A commercial bank in Nigeria, Access Bank, issued a green bond of over 15 billion, which was also oversubscribed at about 15-16% fixed bond rate. Sovereign green bond was also issued by the government, also above 10 billion. So we have, milestones in those areas. And like I said, the Climate Change Act is also being implemented. Principles and guidelines have been developed for the financing of that. The last flood that just happened some few months ago, we have 36 or 37 states in Nigeria. Of those 37 states, 33 of them were affected by flood, severe flood. So to say that those things are not impacting on us would be a denial. But the emphasis is also to do that sustainability in such a way that it is Pareto optimal. Business as usual is still there, new innovations are there. We have a lot of sun, we have 12 months of sunlight in Nigeria. So we have wind farms already created. The central bank on its own has actually created some buckets of funds to finance, green projects, including solar panels. We have a project now to provide solar to house to 25 million Nigerians. That is a central bank funding, but through the commercial bank. So a lot is going on in that space. Thank you.
All right, just 1 minute. The minister can come in first, and then Michael.
Merci. Je voudrais juste...
Thank you. I would just like to continue with what Mr. Rama has said. I think here that we need to draw a lesson of this evolution, because each country has specificities about how to enter transition. For Gabon, for instance, we are developing a great project of natural gas, and we have another project for renewable energies, and we are focusing ourselves on water. And Morocco said talk about wind energy, and in Chad or Senegal, I think you have so many projects that are being implemented when it comes to solar. But we have this mixture, this blending in our country. Now, talking about liquidity, I would like to say that in the CIMAC zone, we have difficulties, be it for energy projects, but projects in general, to finance the various costs of a certain number of investment. I'm taking the role of the regulator, because as Minister of Economy and of Finance, we know the recommendations and the expectation of the banking sector or local banking sector, that can be one of the first institutions that we can call upon if we need them. We know that at some levels it is very difficult to comply with the levels, and banks cannot afford that because they are compelled with the liquidity ratios. First, their own funds and the ratio on risk division. And the case of our guest from Morocco, Mr. Mohammed, I think the regulator must adapt to the evolution, because banks in their investment portfolio must be able to take into account this specificity or evolution of finance to factor in great energy projects. We have talked about so many solutions, going from SPVs, those are autonomous companies that are sharing projects, and for the profit, thanks to the profitability, we can finance renewable energy. Also, we have things that are done when we talk about public-private partnership, and in Gabon we have some water projects when we talk about electricity that are funded by these means. I think we can go beyond that, those companies, and help them to continue on our climate projects. Talking about green financing today we have solutions, but the need is that today we must be able to go progressively. The needs on the African continent are about $4,000 billion for a transition till 2050, and it means that today we are predicting ourselves on levels that are a bit high. And what Morocco has said shows that we have objectives, and progressively each and every state can enter this dynamic.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I want to add two takeaways that I brought for, I think, many financial institutions, but especially Africa from COP. Because if we need to prepare ourselves that we won't make the 1.5. So that means two things. I think that all FIs need to think about climate risks in their portfolio, because it will be there. And we all know, unfortunately, that Africa will be hit potentially first and hardest. So that's also something that we help our clients with, to really think through what are those risks and how can you mitigate them. That's one. The other thing I want to bring into this conversation, it's about adaptation and resilience. So not only financing renewable energy as in the production of it and generation, but also thinking through how can we actually help. And we just discussed in the pre-discussion things like there's a small company which is called Sun Culture, and Sun Culture that finances water pumps based on solar. So where there's no grid available and where there's no water available, there will be water in the ground. So these type of solutions we also need to think through beyond financing large wind parks and large solar farms, which are also necessary. But think through what can we do on adaptation and resilience to improve and to prepare, because COP told us that the 1.5 is unfortunately very low chance of making it.
I just want also, to think about, everything is about transitioning. And that's the reason why I love, the word, the just transition. And Africa will have to do it, but will have to find the right path to do it. And if I have to take one of the takeaway of the COP27 has been the nature-based solution, discussion. This one is phenomenal. And you know what? It means, well, I always think, that Africa got nature. We've been talking about forestry. We haven't been talking, but I will be talking about ocean. And those two nature, will help to, capture, I would say, emission that will come in any case. Because, when we talk about green is costly. Green is costly. We need to say that, right?
Yeah.
And it means that, okay, so Africa will have, to invest in costly, I would say, new, technology. You know what? I mean, does it mean that we have to pay the cost, for the greenness, right? And I say, well, maybe I would say something which is totally politically incorrect, but I'll say that, the nature will give Africa a kind of right to emission somehow.
Yeah. No, I fully agree. And I was at COP, and we, as a DFI, promised that we will speed up encourage our forestry portfolio to go beyond 500 million towards 1 billion even, because we see what you mean, and it's absolutely necessary to invest more in nature-based solutions. You mentioned oceans, but forestry is now on the forefront. The question there is, what is in the end, talk about bankable solutions, the business model behind it, and we are experimenting with it because it will need to come. It's not a question if, but the question is how, and it's something we need to experiment with, and we're very much willing to do so.
But just as important, who sets the standards for these investments behind forestry? Is it, countries like Gabon? Do we agree on something at the AU level? Do banks, perhaps, at TJ Wafa and Oracle, do you sit down and agree on those standards?
Oui, alors c'est vrai qu'il y a une problématique très.
Yes, there is a very important issue here, is the issue of how we can promote the natural capital, not only in Africa. The same reflection is going on in the United States. The interest is that ultimately, if you assess the debt level of African countries, not only on the GDP level, but also natural capital, by taking into account the issue of externalities. We did not talk much about that. We have an additional leverage point that can help countries to get the debts. And to talk about our attitude as commercial banks, we are like middlemen. We have to raise the capital where it is available and share it through the various operators of various scale, which is a challenge today. If you say today that the COP did not meet the expectations because there was no clear-cut commitment, we need to consider the fact that African countries must play their role. And I can see, and Rama said that when we started, a continent where 50% of the people have no access to energy, and others said that Bill Gates said that it will indecent to ask Africans not to get to industrialization, talking about global warming, and they only contribute to the tune of 3%. We need to have a very comprehensive approach. Yes, there is a virtual circle. First of all, providing financing for energy on Africa, industrialization in Africa, and these two priorities are going to start or prompt a virtual circle. Instead of exporting the raw bauxite to China, Germany. If we can process the bauxite locally at Forikaria, Conakry, we're going to have reduced all the pollution generated by transportation by sea. Mohammed. Yes, I think that the African continent will have a huge potential of wealth. We've been saying that, but we cannot materialize that. That means that we need to address the issue in a pragmatic way, and the time is ticking against us. For years, we'll be talking about a very important deficit in terms of electricity to get the African continent on the path of industrialization. We have to go there. We're going to be 3 billion in 2030. I can imagine how can we generate job for our children and our grandchildren in a 30 years to come without capabilities in terms of energy that will help us to forge ahead. That's why in this approach I concur with who the president of Togo said today. He said that we needed to tackle the future without our confidence, but we need to be pragmatic. Yes, people need to sit around a table, political decision makers, regulators, and multilateral partners, commercial banks, capital market operators. We need to set together to come up with operational roadmap. And I concur with what the Minister of Economy of Gabon said. We are Africa's. We need to adapt our approaches based on the peculiarities of each and every country. But the common denominator, what is the common denominator? Is the vision. It's an institutional governance. It's about stability of the legal framework and a tax framework and the increase of the human resources in skills. We forget the human capital in this. Today, we are operating a transition across our banks, but there is a lack of skill and resources. So the universities and higher education institutions need to really guide people to their future professions, and these are issues regarding adaptation, mitigation, decarbonizing our economies. We need expertise. We cannot continue exporting expertise, by the way. So, well, that's why I think that such panels, such forums that give an opportunity to discuss and share experience help us at least to come up with concrete, tangible proposal to the decision makers.
We're running up against the clock here, but I'd like to ask each of my panelists very briefly. We've spoken about the need to get capital from point A to point B. We've spoken about the need to incentivize people to make that switch, because it's not sufficient to simply come in as governments and say you have to go down the renewable pathway. People need to see why that needs to happen. So let's put it simply, 30 seconds. What's on your top 3 to-do items when you tell governments, listen, if you want to get people on board with our agenda for just transition to get more people into renewable, what needs to be done? Dr. Hassan, let's start with you.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to build on what Muhammad was saying. And it's important that we emphasize this shared responsibility and accountability. The state, and I mean the state, the government, needs to play a leading role. We want the private sector, AFIS, to partner with the public to get this achieved, but the private sector requires efficiency and profitability. So the sunk cost must come from the state, and that state must be accountable to the people as an agency or an institution leading this process. If we don't get that lead, then you don't see, and that lead will also mean de-risking the sector, or de-risking green financing. So I think it is very important we have that shared responsibility and that accountability on the part of every player in this game to ensure that everybody does its part. We can't just throw it to the private sector to do it, or partnership, or multilateral donors. No. Everybody must take a particular role in that space. Thank you.
Ferdinand.
Oui, je crois que cette étude symphonie que nous...
I think it is something on which we must all agree. Each and everyone must play his role. States must contribute in improving business environment and stabilize the regulatory framework. Also, central banks are concerned, and each and even the private sector must take responsibility and if we have a big picture, we can advance on the debate.
Being able to know what the rules of play are. What else?
So that's one. Two, blended finance. And if those things are in place, or they might in place, we're more than happy to anchor investor green bonds with you guys. And girls, and everyone else.
Mohamed, your top three. What are the things that governments need to do?
As commercial bank, we must ease mobilization at the local level, financial inclusion, and make sure that everything is bankable, even through digital means. Second element is that public authorities must help the private sector to get mobilized in the strategic sectors, be it in energy security, food security, and protection against natural catastrophes. Third element, being very important also, is a human capital. Our universities, schools must be like a bridge with the society to have elites for tomorrow jobs. I will just repeat what Mr. El Ketani said. We must mobilize savings and we must intermediate to have sovereignty and avoid things to be told us. I have also the topic of the nature, that is solution for climate, preservation of our forest, oceans. I think that's very important. And you are right, human capital, human that we are, we must play our role. So we must lead by example. Thanks. I want to say that states have central roles to bring together all the actors on sustainable development way. We must work together to have these projects talking about the climate, and I'm saying that we have the CAP in French, that is the knowledge with the capacity building, bringing in universities around the table or researchers, and we have assets. All regulators, banks, etc., we must do everything to accompany the transition, and the pillar is a platform. Today we are all gathered here to exchange on our various experiences that can be implemented from a country to the other. So I want to say that this African market needs a mutualization of all efforts so that we can take up the challenge of energy transition. Thanks.
That is our conversation on COP27 and how that affects the funding landscape. A round of applause, please, for my panelists. Thank you very much.